All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a massive economic question today, one with huge real-world consequences, especially for Latin America. We're digging into some fascinating new research that asks a really simple but profound question. Does inequality actually hurt a country's growth?
So let me just put it to you like this. Does letting that gap between the rich and the poor get too wide actually slam the brakes on an entire economy? It's a question that really challenges some old-school economic ideas, and for good reason.
And look, this isn't just some academic squabble. You've got heavy hitters like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, weighing in. They're saying, point blank, that high inequality is a drag on growth over the long haul. That really sets the stage for why getting this right is so important.
So just how big of a deal has this become? Well, let's be clear, this is way more than just a puzzle for economists anymore. It's a top-tier global concern.
I mean, get this, the World Economic Forum, where all the world leaders get together, they're putting rising inequality right up there with things like climate change as a major trend that's going to shape our future. So yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so if we're going to answer this big question, we first need a really good way to measure inequality. And, it turns out that's way trickier than it sounds.
See, for the longest time, everyone just looked at income. But the researchers we're talking about today, they argue that's kind of like a doctor diagnosing you just by taking your temperature. Sure, it tells you something might be wrong, but you're missing the whole picture. So what do? They built a brand new tool, a composite inequality index. Think of it like a full-body MRI instead of just a thermometer. It's designed to give us a much clearer, more complete diagnosis of a country's economic health.
Okay, so what's in the secret sauce? Well, this new index combines three crucial things. First up, wealth. Who actually owns all the stuff? The stocks, the houses, the whole shebang. Then you've got how the economic pie itself is sliced up. How much goes to workers as wages versus how much goes to owners as profit. And finally, the classic one, personal income. The actual gap in what people are taking home in their paychecks. Now here's a clever bit. Getting good data on wealth is a pretty new thing, so the researchers were smart about it. They used a two-part version of their index to look way back to the 1980s. And then they used the full three-part version for a really deep dive into the more recent years, once that wealth data became available.
All right, so they've got this powerful new measuring stick. What did they actually find when they pointed at Latin America? Let's take a look at the results.
Okay, the first number that jumps out is 0.60. That was the average score for the whole region. Now, on a scale where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is complete inequality, 0.6 is a seriously high number. It tells you right away, this is a big issue.
And it's not the same everywhere, right? You could see a real spread. At the top of the list, the most unequal, you've got Panama, Colombia, and Mexico. And then down at the other end of the scale, the least unequal, you'll find Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Argentina. So let's break it down. When you look at wealth, again, who owns the assets? The story is, well, not much changed. A couple of countries like Uruguay and Colombia did see some improvement, but for most places, wealth inequality just stayed stubbornly high. But when you look at how that economic pie is split, things get a little more complicated. In places like Mexico and Panama, the share going to profits actually went up, but in Brazil, the share going to wages went up instead. So you've got these really different things happening all at once. Okay, but here's the real kicker. This is super important. If you only looked at that traditional income measure, you'd think, hey, things are getting better almost everywhere. And that's exactly why you need this three-part index. It stops you from getting a totally misleading picture of what's really going on.
Okay, so we've got this really detailed, nuanced picture of inequality now. But what does this have to do with economic growth? And this, my friends, is where things get really interesting. A real puzzle starts to emerge.
Because when the researchers looked at countries one by one, the results were just all over the map. I mean, it was a total mixed bag. In Argentina and Brazil, you see a clear link. More inequality, less growth. But then you look at Chile and Colombia, and what do you see? The complete opposite. Higher inequality was linked to higher growth. So what gives?
And that contradiction, that puzzle, is what makes this research so cool. To figure it out, they had to completely change how they were looking at the problem. So let's get to the final verdict.
So instead of getting bogged down in the data from just one country at a time, they asked a really simple but powerful question. What happens if we just zoom out? What if we look at the whole region at once?
And boom, there it is. The answer.
The magic number is negative 0.32. Okay, what on earth does that mean in plain English? It's simple, really. For every 1-point jump in that inequality index, economic growth tends to drop by about 1/3 of a point. The signal was finally clear through all the noise. For Latin America as a whole, more inequality equals less growth, period. Puzzle solved.
So, let's just quickly wrap up what we've learned here. First, the big one. For Latin America as a whole, higher inequality is tied to lower economic growth. Second, this isn't a fluke. It's statistically significant and holds up no matter which index you use. And finally, this whole thing is a huge wake-up call that we need to get way better at tracking wealth data.
And that really brings us to the final big idea here. This research doesn't just give us an answer, it totally reframes the whole conversation. It suggests fighting inequality isn't just a social issue, but a core part of economic strategy. So the real question this leaves us with is, if this is a key to unlocking economic growth, what's the next move?